Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Wednesday, June 19th, and I'm sitting down to talk about the gnarly group of transits that are coming through this week, which clearly are affecting a lot of people. All of my clients have mentioned things happening in their personal life this week that have been very much in line with the ongoing transits. My own personal life has been affected, my wife's personal life, like it's everywhere. So it's a big transit. Let's talk about it. We've got the planet Mercury and the planet Mars moving through a conjunction with one another in the sign of Cancer. As they are doing so, they are moving through an opposition to both the South Node, Saturn, and Pluto. I've talked about this numerous times already. But what is special about the transit today, right now, is that both Mercury and Mars are conjoined while moving through an opposition to Pluto. And that opposition is very powerful. And we're dealing with that while we also have Jupiter's square to Neptune occurring basically at the same time. Venus is about to enter into a T-square with these three planets as well. So I want to talk a little bit about that today and give you guys an update. So I'm going to put it up on the screen so that you can get the real-time clock, see what's going on. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to draw out so you can see these. Here is Mercury and Mars with the North Node in Cancer. And opposite this stellium of planets, even the moon is passing through Capricorn right now, though it's now void of course and not going to make any contacts with anything before leaving Capricorn and entering Aquarius. Still, when the moon is moving for 3-4 days at a time through Saturn-ruled signs, what can we expect? What can you anticipate from this transit, also given that the moon is moving through Saturn-ruled signs? Well, first of all, the opposition to Saturn and the opposition to Pluto in a Saturn-ruled sign, Capricorn, they're all traveling Saturn and Pluto with the south node of the moon, which is of the nature of Saturn. The moon is in Saturn's sign. It's going to move into Aquarius, where it's also in Saturn's sign. So we're talking about a restrictive moment. We're talking about the forces or pressures of necessity. Now, there is sometimes people have a lot of questions when they first start learning about ancient astrology, or you've never studied ancient astrology, you don't know exactly what it is. You pick up on it and it feels like it's sort of prescriptive, or it feels a little, sometimes you start wondering, well, how deterministic were the ancient astrologers? How locked in or fated are all of the events of life? You can wonder that now. People were wondering it thousands of years ago when astrology first came out. Astrology can't solve the answer, or it can't give the answer to the question, can't solve the problem of fate and free will. It's not meant to. The problem remains deeply mysterious, specifically because both fate and free will exist. There was something that the philosopher Hegel said, if you know anything about the history of philosophy. He's kind of a more modern Western type of philosopher compared to the ancient mystics, but he said something that I believe was likely embraced by ancient astrologers as well, which is that oftentimes when we're presented by a pair of opposites, like fate and free will, or freedom and necessity, or freedom and fate, or something like that, we unnecessarily, ironically, try to figure out which side of an opposition is correct, when usually there exists a higher platform in which both are true, and the paradox of both being true simultaneously is embodied in a third higher perspective. This is what I would call essentially the mystical or spiritual perspective that we start to take on over time when we study astrology. Because when you start to reflect on your life through the lens of astrology, you often see that in every experience, both sides of an opposition are present. For example, things happen to us all the time that are tangibly, and sort of objectively bad, but there is also a level at which they are good, and we see that and we experience that and we know that. And so we can't say it's good or bad. And a lot of the times, when we get together with friends, one of the things that defines a friendship is the ability to share both the good and the bad. Really, what we mean when we say that is our ability to share the heart of experience itself, which is always both good and bad. You know what I mean? So I'm saying all of this, why? Because when we go into talking about a powerful opposition like the one we're facing right now, which I'm going to break down more specifically here in a minute, but when we're getting into an opposition like this, I've talked about oppositions a lot in the past month, specifically because of this transit, we are tempted to think in terms, get really extreme. We're tempted to polarize. When there's a lot of Saturnine energy in the air, the South Node, Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn and Saturn sign, and the moon is currently traveling through the Capricorn and Aquarius while this is all happening, Saturn sign, things will feel like the weight or gravity of necessity, fate, and a more determined outcome, is at hand. So the feeling that I don't have a lot of choice in this, the pressures of the moment are mounting, right? And there is something happening that's beyond my control. For example, I'll never forget when my wife, after my wife had given birth to our second child, the first one had to be induced in a somewhat of an emergency situation and ended up being okay. But because of that, my wife's second labor was very different from her first. And when she was finished giving birth with our second daughter, she said, I'm amazed at how at a certain point in the labor, my body was just doing birth. And I became sort of possessed by my body's birthing. And it really didn't matter if I wanted to do it or not. The moment of our birth, in a very physical sense, is necessary in the same way that a woman's body will just necessarily contract like that. And women often have that experience when they're in birth of saying, my body just knew what to do. Doulas say, trust the wisdom of your body. So we should remember that the force of fate, the force of Saturn, the force of, heavy, determined realities, whether they're really enjoyable or really dramatic, whether they're and difficult, whatever they may be, that there comes many times in our life where all of the multiple different timelines and streams of choices that we make and so on and so forth collapse down into these passageways that are like birth canals, and the force of fate becomes like the contractions of a woman's body during birth, and it feels like we don't have a choice. However, we should remember that it is choices that we have made, not all of which we understand, not all of which we can trace the history of in this lifetime, what to speak of innumerable lifetimes previously, that have led to this moment where the forces of nature, the forces of fate, are simply taking over and contracting and squeezing and pushing out a determined outcome. And that could be the crystallization of hard work. That could be a loss. It could be a hard separation. It could be whatever. It could be anything, right? But the feeling that accompanies it, of the loss of control, has to be put into the context of what fate and necessity actually are, which is they are a part of the way that the momentum of choice operates in this world. Choice exists within a stream of material forces that are also bound by laws. So Saturn represents the way that the place where law takes over. And it's not that laws are absolute in the sense that they can't be bent or changed. Almost all mystical traditions say at the end of the day, the law is subservient to the spirit, not the other way around, which is to say the essential consciousness that we are, and that is a part of the source that directs everything, the intelligence of the Tao or God or whatever you'd like to call it, the universe, is greater and higher than the laws. And yet the laws are governing and organizing and moving everything along. And so when we come into these moments, we have to keep all of this in context. It's not that you're losing, if something's happening that feels like it's out of your control right now, it's not that you didn't have a choice in creating this outcome. It's not that you will, it's not also up to you to fully understand how you created this outcome or how you were a part of the creation of this outcome, because it's not just our choices, but it's the choices of many, many other free agents. And then when these birth canals come and there's contractions and the force of fate takes over, the best advice is to remember that there is an interaction between choice and these forces, and also to trust these forces, these passages, that what happens during these passages ultimately, if we study the sort of law of the moment, the Saturnine teaching of the moment, becomes incredibly instructive. Every gateway to birth that we have, every incarnation that we take, and when we kind of come into the world through the force of the contraction, when we come into the world, that moment is essentially the start of a form and a shape of a lifetime that is in some ways fated by the very forces that bring it into being. It's fated. Do you see what I'm saying? It has the Saturnine force behind its very coming into the world. So we're all fated beings. However, we are the shape of our life, the form that our life takes, the different contours that come along and force us down different channels. Many of those things come from previous lifetimes and are locked in before, at the moment of birth, basically, but prior to even being born. But we still have some choice, and it's up to us to study the interaction of our choice and to study these contractive gateways that we're moved through. Because if we study them carefully, if we reflect on them as we're going through them or in the wake of having gone through them, they will teach us. And they'll teach us one very important thing, which is they'll teach us how to be more conscious, which means how to be more free. So necessity and freedom they go together hand in hand, because none of us in this material universe as conscious beings really fully understand or know how to use our freedom or our conscious nature. Every force of necessity, if reflected upon consciously, becomes an agent of change for higher consciousness or for greater freedom. So we have to look at it that way, because if we don't, then we start to dichotomize and we start to say, well, it's the fate that's taking away my free will. We have to look at them together. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to say, because this is a highly contractive Saturnine kind of moment. Now, it's colored by a lot of other energies. It's colored by Pluto, Lord of death and rebirth. There is a feeling behind every Plutonian opposition as though not only is something necessary, Pluto also carries with it a Saturnine signature. In fact, if you look at the hard aspects that were present, it was an opposition, almost perfect opposition between Saturn and Pluto at the time that Pluto was discovered. So there's, Pluto is very Saturnine in a way, but Pluto has a lot to do with where there is some necessity, like Saturn, where there's contraction. Pluto is really also, you can think of Saturn a little bit more like the contractions of birth. Pluto is a bit more like the embodiment of the pain, the labor, and the process of both fusion and intense blowout or separation. So you almost think Saturn is a bit more like the force of necessity taking over the body and pushing the baby out the birth canal, shaping it with its bones and its structure. You think of Pluto as a bit more like the raw primal force, power, scream, blood, and then when it comes out, as well as the bliss, the overwhelming serotonin or whatever, the oxytocin that floods you, and the feeling of regeneration. So Pluto has a bit more of a feeling of kind of like a black hole that you're getting sucked into as something's dying, and it has that contractive presence as well. It has the force of fate and necessity behind it. Liz Green wrote a great book about this, actually, called The Astrology of Fate. It's a lot about Pluto, mentions Pluto and Saturn's relationship as well. But it's also this feeling of just the sort of supernova of light and heat and regeneration that comes afterward. So if you've ever been if you've ever had to purge before, I drank ayahuasca for a long time, and the purge, the experience of the purge, there's all different levels of the experience, but the process itself is very potent. So right now, this is contractive. It's deeply. It's kind of a strangled passage that we're moving through, and the loss of the feeling of agency or choice is very strong, and people will try to fight against that. So this is what, according to our doula, right at birth, I was talking to her about this, telling her about ayahuasca experiences and purging, and we were comparing notes about what it's like, because I wanted to understand more about birth, and this was prior to seeing my wife actually go through it. And one of the things I remember her saying is that, the most important thing really is for a woman to allow her body's wisdom to do its work, and to, in a sense, the woman becomes a midwife to herself, right? She becomes a sister to her own body. And there's something very deep about women's communing with one another when they do this as well. And in that process, as you are midwifing your own body's birth, that's how, in some way, you become a mother. And that's how she was explaining it to me. And I was saying, yeah, there's a way in an ayahuasca ceremony when you're purging, when you're trying to purge something, where you go, if you try to resist it, and she was saying that women, if they try to resist as well, will go through this. If you try to resist it, if you fight against it, if you're an unwilling participant, if you don't just step in and move right into the fire of that space, midwifing the purge through the fire of the purge. And, basically she said the same thing. If a woman is not stepping into the experience, moving into it, helping midwife it, etc., struggles against it, not only will she struggle a lot more, but she's robbing herself in some ways of the experience of birth, which it births something new in her. It's a kind of psychosomatic initiation, right? And I'm not saying anything women don't know already, but for me as a man, this happened more intensely for me during 10 years of working with ayahuasca. And this is a Plutonian moment where people will feel restricted. They'll feel restrained. They won't like the responsibilities, the duties, the obligations, the things that are being forced upon them, something in the environment that feels like it's a threat, or something that feels like it's bearing down upon them and demanding something, right? That's the force of the contraction. But if we don't go along with it, if we fight against it, which is what Mars and Mercury are prone to do right now in an opposition, to lash out verbally, mentally, emotionally, to manipulate, to pass off, or to pass off the responsibility to someone else, rather than saying the buck stops here. That there is a potential chance to want to manipulate or coerce, or go around, circumnavigate something rather than going through. That's what Cancer likes to do. The crabs scuttle sideways, and Pluto's saying, nope, there's no way through this, but going right through it. And Pluto and Saturn in the South Node altogether, plus the Moon in Saturn signs all throughout this process this week, will not let it happen. It's too much, so you can't escape. There's no way out. There's hard contractions coming. If you fight against it, it's going to hurt, right? If you fight against it, then the process happens in spite of you, not with you. And none of us want that, because what we all want is to say, I am with me. I am here with me and I can do this. I'm not going to cheat. I'm not going to go around. I'm not going to take a side cut. I'm not going to try to make someone else do the hard work that I, don't want to do. I'm not going to confront this because I'm going to I'm going to manipulate some other story or whatever. I'm just going to confront it. I'm just going to go through it. And I'm going to, and the best advice really right now is to soften through it as well. Now, if you don't do that, then, what happens? Well, typically that's when right now emotional blowouts are going to happen. Confrontation and hostility will happen. Argumentation that is more potentially personally harmful can happen. Violent outbursts and difficult emotional bonds that are severed. That we have emotional connections with others. They become difficult. We sever them rather suddenly, dramatically, and harm. With malice. Those are things you have to be careful right now because people don't want to have the conversation. They don't. Maybe they don't want to go through it, or they don't want to. So they'll, like, for example, when I was in my early 20s, I hate to say it, but like and I knew that it was like time to break up with someone I was dating, and I didn't want to do it. And I think a lot of people are like this. Maybe guys are like this more. I don't know. I think probably, but I would just stop calling. I would just kind of disappear. I wasn't as bad as ghosting people, but it would be that kind of like slowly disengage. And the person sitting there spinning out like, why aren't you calling me? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh no, nothing's wrong. Oh no, nothing's wrong. Oh, isn't that the worst? And I've had that done to me since then. So the karma came around, but it's just the worst when people do that versus just saying, look, I don't think this is working for me. I've really enjoyed your company and I'm just not interested in dating. Simple, right? And kind and letting someone down easily. So there's a lot of, if there's an attempt to try to work your way around, well, like I can't really give birth right now. I can't. Well, in birth, you don't really have a choice. It's coming on. And there's all sorts of ways that we have of, so in summary, there are all kinds of ways that we might have right now of trying to avoid the force of necessity or trying to pass the responsibility on to someone else. I don't want to have to do this because it's difficult. So I'm going to find a way of trying to get someone else to do it for me. Be careful of that kind of stuff. Even if you're thinking like, well, I'll just avoid this till later because, it's just, I got to wait for a more favorable time so that under these conditions, under these circumstances, people will know that you're trying to avoid something. Even if you do it, even if you do the thing you got to do in 2 weeks from now, people will know that you've been avoiding it. And that hurts worse, So be careful of all that kind of stuff. Now, the other thing about the force of necessity and the transformative process of Pluto is that whatever's happening right now is truly trying to offer us a new lease on life. It's trying to offer us a regenerated sense of blood and vitality. And that's spiritually speaking, as well as perhaps physically. It might have something to do with your job or your house or your life setup in some way. It's very physical and objective. It could also have a lot to do with an emotional state of renewal that just needs to come through. Now, people sometimes will also, like, for example, how many times do you see this happen? I can tell you it happens all the time in the yoga world when people go on some kind of spiritual holiday or retreat and they get a clear message. This needs to change, right? Something's got to change. And then they get high on that realization rather than taking the realization and going and doing something with it that's practical. They get high on that realization. Yep, everything's different now. Everything's different. Well, no, it's not. It's not different until you do something about it. Until you've actually done the work to put the realization into action in your life, you're just feeling high on the knowledge of truth. And it's true. Truth is beautiful. Truth is something to get high about. When you're in touch with truth and it's spiritual truth and you know it in your heart, yeah, it's exhilarating. But unless you do something with it in terms of the world that you live in, it will be a short-lived experience, no better than a tasty popsicle. You know what I mean? It's not going to last. So we have to do things with the realizations that we have. And this is an opportunity to do something, and it's also an opportunity to try and bypass the birth canal of this experience by feeling high and self-righteous and whatever. And then we can in that attempt, we're trying to, it's like Cancer, the sideways walker, we're trying to walk around or scuttle around the direct thing that we need to do. If we really have a deep realization, one of my teachers once said, if you have a really deep realization, don't tell it to anybody, even yourself. Instead, hide it from yourself and kind of like keep your fingers crossed about it and say, I'll talk to myself about how great this realization is and how wonderful and nice and exciting it is after I've done the thing that I need to do. Then I'll talk to myself about it. Then I'll have the realization. Otherwise, as soon as we have a realization, oftentimes there's action steps that come with it. We write them down. We say, these are the things I need to go do. And we don't even let ourselves take any kind of joy or exhilaration in this. And we don't see this. You go on social media, what do you see? Mostly people writing about realizations, right? Social media is like a confessional box all the time. People writing about their realizations, and I now know I need to change this, and I now know that, I now know this. And, not to be, some kind of hard ass here. I don't have anything figured out myself, but the way I've increasingly felt about that, seeing that kind of post, and even when I'm tempted to write them is, you know what? You haven't realized anything. Just when you know something, when you really know something, then do something. And then let the doing speak for itself. Let the actions speak for themselves. Actions speak louder than words often, right? So this is also a moment where we could feel really like emotionally and mentally and verbally clear about something. And yet necessity, Pluto, Saturn, Capricorn, tons of Capricorn, Saturn energy right now, and Aquarius coming through in the next couple of days. Doesn't mean anything unless the contractions start coming and actual change happens. If you try to avoid those, it's very possible that you will, you'll abort the birth process, and you won't get to the real thing that you're hoping for. So some other things to look at right now. One of the reasons that we have to call this into question, actions versus dreams and fantasies. Are we actually doing something with the realizations we're having, or are we just getting high and then trying to avoid the real work? Are we trying to move to the conclusion before we've done the work of getting there? For example, sometimes you want to break up with someone, you want to end a marriage, you want to end a job, and you're like, yeah, it's over. It's over. You know what I mean? Same thing. Well, is it over? And be careful. Be careful of getting high on, it's not over until it's over kind of thing. Take the careful steps. Do the careful work. The vision guiding your future right now, what lies beyond the hard labor of the moment, may very well be incredibly enlightening and uplifting and regenerative. But hide that from yourself. Because I have a feeling, just like in the Bible, when we try to walk on water, if we start getting real self-conscious, real proud of ourselves that we're walking on water, if we look down at our feet and revel too much in the fact that we're walking on water, we start to sink. And that's because our faith is made real through substantive action. Our faith demonstrates itself in the world when we do something about it. So this is very important right now with all the Saturnine emphasis in the midst of a Jupiter-Neptune square, which is like very idealistic. We might have a vision that is like mighty wind in our sails right now and full speed ahead. That's great. But I'm being very careful in my own life right now to also make sure that each necessary step is taken seriously, and that I don't get ahead of that I don't imagine it's going to be easier than it will be, that I don't take anything for granted. Right? Very, very important. Now, you also have to imagine that when it's time for difficult changes to happen, some people are just not going to go along with it. Some people are going to resist and defy and try to make you feel really bad, try to coerce or manipulate you, try to make you feel really shitty. And that's part of the Mars in its fall with Mercury in the sign of Cancer, the moon, right? It's well, this doesn't work for me, or you're neglecting my needs, or you're hurting my feelings, or you're doing something that really, is bad for me, and you're leaving me behind, and you should consider this, and you should do that. And, oh, you're so selfish. You should be doing this thing, and you should be doing that thing. And, well, so all of the ways that someone may try to manipulate us right now. And oftentimes this is because we're all connected through intricate karmic, an intricate karmic web. And when we're giving birth to something, when we are in the process of going with the contractions, entering into the fire of it, and just being a midwife to our own transformation, and we go through that, and other people around us who are resisting, who are fighting, who are in denial, who don't want to do the work, who want to skip past the difficult parts, who are in denial of the real work that it takes to make changes in our life, those people will get upset. They'll get upset because your changing reflects upon them. Because a lot of the times people who don't do that kind of work, who aren't willing to do that kind of work, frankly, they live in a world, we all know this because we do this. I'm not saying I'm above it or something. I do this too from time to time, and I think we all do. When we do that, then we're in a space of just living through comparisons, right? Well, my life is what it is in comparison to all these other people around me, or in comparison to a projected audience that I have out there, or whatever. And when we live like that, then when other people that are in our little matrix of imagined reality change, it changes our sense of what's real, and that's threatening to us. So then we get upset, and then we try to coerce or manipulate with Mercury, Mars, and Cancer, and get really pissed off. So the feeling like someone's invading your emotional space right now is potentially very real, right? So you have to be very careful about that. For someone to not respect boundaries, for someone to try to coerce because their reality is too fragile to allow for you or whoever else to go through some kind of really deep change. It's the same thing when people try to get out of relationships and the other person becomes possessive or crazy, right? So you have to be careful of all of that kind of stuff right now. So, and again, behind it all, Jupiter, Neptune, there's an expanded vision. There's a hope. There's a dream. There's a message. There's a higher state of consciousness. There's a seeking of, where do I belong? What's my dharma? And what's the higher wisdom here? Seeking, it's a good time to kind of consult the sage, consult a teacher, consult your inner knowing, however you do that. And just ask the question, like, where am I supposed to go? How do I do this? Because sometimes the other thing that happens is we get overwhelmed by experiences like this. We don't know how to walk through it. We don't know exactly what we're supposed to do. It's not as obvious sometimes. It's like, well, just breathe and push, or wait until the wave comes and then push with it, or whatever. Sometimes it's not as instinctual to us. During times of transformation, we don't always know how or what to do in order to go with the experience. There's some sense of choices that we have to make that we don't know what to do about, or we're caught between a rock and a hard place. So some of that feeling of not knowing what to do, of how to be a good steward to the moment, that feeling of being bewildered or confused, that might be in the air a little bit right now too. Kind of looking for your inner sage to give you that guidance, looking for teachers, looking for wisdom to say, go this way, do this, but that's available for us right now as well with Jupiter square Neptune. Venus coming into the T-square with Neptune and Jupiter in the next week is also going to, in some ways it'll be some blessings that will rain down on us. Some real good fortune, good luck, friends, people that will come to aid or come to assist. But you have to remember that, sometimes people will also come to offer us help, and they'll do so specifically in order to try to maintain, there's an underlying agenda to keep maintaining the status quo because, oh my God, these changes are coming and I don't want them to happen. So, hey, like that. So for example, sometimes kids, they want to go to a school their parents don't like, they want to do something that their parents are critical of, and their parents say, here's $10,000 to go do the thing that I want you to do. Oh my God, what great good fortune. It'd be very seductive. And then the kid may not follow their heart and instead take the 10,000 and go to some other school. So these kinds of attempts to bless people or to give or receive blessings as a way of moving around the difficult experience, be careful of that in the next week. On the other hand, I don't want anyone to look a gift horse in the mouth. It's quite possible that legitimate help can come right now. And we have to be very discerning about that with Neptune in the mix, and with the propensity of Venus and Jupiter to be very indulgent and to, be somewhat delusional at times in terms of, the appetites and desires, and like, ooh, that looks nice. Of course I'm going to take that. We have to be a little bit more discerning right now with everything that's going on. The emotions are going to step up. The feeling of emotional vulnerability is going to step up quite a bit in the next couple of days as we walk through the summer solstice passageway, which we'll talk about soon. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I hope that this was helpful. As always, I hope that you're able to take this astrological wisdom and put it to work in your life, but also that just the pure reflection on these, hearing about these things at all, helps our minds to dwell in the stars and in the heavens where, there's a celestial music playing all the time. And we take that back into our lives, and it becomes very difficult to stay anxious or to stay worried or depressed. We've gotten the chance to hear the music of the spheres, even just for a little bit. It really brings a higher quality of consciousness into our lives. And that's what we need. We need the stars with us because they're the great musicians that fill our lives with the sounds of transcendental beauty. We really need that. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Stay tuned. We'll be talking about the solstice coming up. Take care. Bye.